company in India. And they also suggested that though we have regulators for banks and financial institutions to ensure lending behavior, we do not have a similar regulator to ensure debt restructuring of companies in India, and they proposed the setting up of such a regulatory body. So as a result of BLRC's recommendations in 2016, the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code was enacted. The broad features of the code are that the code encourages a focus on revival of a corporate as opposed to a direct reference to winding up, which is what the earlier practice was. Earlier, if a company was unable to pay its debts, you filed a petition for winding up of the company under the Companies Act. However, under the code, there is greater emphasis on attempting to restructure the debts of the company. The purpose behind this is that there is value in the organizational capital of a company, which is wasted if the company is directly sent to winding up. If the debts are restructured, then there is greater value maximization, and it's a better proposition for the business sector as a whole, because then it encourages lending as well. When you know that you're going to derive the maximum value, even if your debt is declared as a bad debt. So under the revival portion of the IBC, there is the corporate insolvency resolution process, which I'm going to refer to as CIRP in the event anyone is confused later on. And there is the fast track CIRP. One of the key features of the IBC is a change from debtor in possession to creditor in control. What this essentially means is that in the earlier statutory frameworks for debt revival, though you try to revive and restructure the debts of the company, the management, the erring defaulting promoters still retained control. For instance, under the SDR scheme, even though creditors had a lot of power to replace the defaulting management, however, the scheme essentially involved conversion of debt into equity, which required management approvals. And in effect, you could not get rid of the management who was the reason why the company had ended up in the debt restructuring process in the first place. What the IBC does is that it puts the creditors in charge of the management from the moment that the application is admitted. A committee of creditors, which is basically a committee of all the financial creditors of the defaulting entity, is formed as soon as the application is admitted. And this body is largely in charge of any debt restructuring decisions that are taken in regards to the company. The code does provide for liquidation. The process is different from what winding up was under the earlier Companies Act. But liquidation has to be resorted to only after 270 days of a moratorium and of CIRP. There is absolutely no way that a resolution of the company can be reached. And even then, liquidation as proposed under the code is attempted in a way to maximize the value that is derived from the assets of the corporate debtor, which is the main purpose of the IBC. IBCs, the benefits of IBC are many, but just off the bat, India has, ever since the IBC was enacted, jumped almost 45 places in the ease of doing business index. We were about 142 when the IBC was enacted. We're already 63 in 2019. So this is largely because of the fact that it's a very robust enactment. It's been amended about 4 times in the last 4 years, and the regulators and the government is very active in noticing the jurisprudence that's revolving around IBC and quickly acting and amending the code to reflect that. One example of this would be that recently, I think everyone would have read that the threshold limit for filing a petition under the IBC was raised to 1 crore in light of the COVID pandemic, because the IBBI understood that even though, because of the conditions right now, there may be a lot of defaults, and the existing threshold, which is 10 lakh, may be too low, and there may be unnecessary proceedings, which is definitely not what the IBC was intended for. So the threshold limit, as of right now, for a temporary period has been raised to 1 crore for invoking the provisions of the IBC.
So just wanted to add that there was news yesterday that NCLT is going to suspend applications for section 7, 8, 7, 9 and 10 for at least 6 months because of the COVID-19. Shilpa, you wanted to mention that?
No, I had forgotten. Thank you, Sneha, for mentioning that. Does anyone have any questions or anything? I'm going to move on to the institutional framework. All right, so
Shilpa, why don't you just continue with the session? If as we indicated earlier, if anyone does have any questions, they'll put that in the chat pod, and perhaps because two of you are presenting this, I hope the person who's not presenting can keep looking at the questions and perhaps weave it into the presentation slides themselves. So as you go along and you come to that particular topic, then you can address that question, and anything that remains can be addressed at the end.
Will do.
Sure.
All right.
Yeah.
So, because the IBC was intended to be a consolidated framework for all debt restructuring and debt revival laws in the country, a lot of entities have been created to ensure that the code is a comprehensive legislation, and you don't need to look outside for anything, any kind of guidance on the code. Because of that, a lot of new institutions have been created under the code. These are said to be the pillars of IBC, and these terms are going to be used a lot, so I'll briefly explain what these bodies are. I have not included the COC in this slide, which is, arguably one of the most important bodies. However, I think Sneha will be dealing with it later on in the procedure part, and that's why I'm not going to go into detail about the COC right now. The first body that we will discuss is basically the insolvency professionals. When the moratorium period begins and the CIRP process starts, insolvency professionals are the ones who are in charge of managing the operations of the entity on a day-to-day basis. They are supposed to ensure that none of the essential services to the corporate debtor over here, which will be the entity which goes into insolvency proceedings, they are the ones who will ensure that essential services are not stopped to the corporate debtor. They are the ones who will ensure that all the claims of all the creditors are collated and are presented for the purposes of a debt resolution, so on and so forth. I think Sneha will also be dealing with a little bit more about what their responsibilities are. So insolvency professional agencies are bodies who are set up to ensure that there is proper governance of these insolvency professionals. So these bodies will ensure that all the insolvency professionals meet the criteria and that there is a code of conduct that they are following. The regulator that has been set up, which is akin to other regulators in other sectors, is the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Board. The Insolvency and Bankruptcy Board is intended to, the board is basically intended to govern all aspects of insolvency proceedings. So what it does is that it will probably ensure that insolvency professionals are following the code of conduct, and the action that is taken against them for not following or not following the responsibilities outlined for them in the code will be taken by the board. The board is also responsible for publication of the rules and regulations under which have been delegated to it under the IBC, and just general oversee of the entire CIRP process on a regulatory angle will be done by the IBBI. Another entity which has been set up is the information utility. This is a new entity. I don't think something similar existed under any of the earlier debt restructuring enactments that we had. What was realized by the BLRC in its report is that one of the major roadblocks for debt restructuring is that usually the adjudicating bodies do not have access to information to establish debt or default. The idea is that these are summary proceedings. The adjudicating authorities should not have to enter into evidence and complicated questions of fact. They should have information readily available before them so that they can quickly decide, since time-bound process is a very, very important part of the code. So information utilities were set up as basically the bodies which are supposed to be a one-stop shop for all kinds of default information. As a financial creditor, you are supposed to lodge information of default with an information utility compulsorily under the code. For operational creditors, this is more of a optional direction that you should do this. I mean, but if you do it, it definitely helps at the stage if you were to file for an action under the IBC, because information available with the information utility is considered to be reliable information. There are certain drawbacks which, considering the nascent stage of the code, have not been looked at, which is what is the authenticity of the information that a creditor is lodging with the information utility, and what is the reliability or the verification of it effectively. However, I think as we go along, these aspects will be ironed out. The other problem is that as of right now, we only have one information utility in India, which is the National E-Governance Service Limited. It's a government company. So, I mean, there are obviously procedural and operational hurdles right now in its functioning. But the idea is for these information utilities to be a database of information regarding defaults, so that the procedure is much faster and more efficient. Lastly,
Shilpa, just a second. Yes. Because the information utilities are not functional as such, the reasoning, the registry is still has always been getting all the applications and all the documentation in soft copies. The reasoning behind is, as and when the information utilities are functioning, this database would be transferred to information utilities.
That's okay.
Yeah.
The last institutional body that's created under the code is obviously the adjudicating authorities. I think most of us will know that NCLT is the adjudicating authority for corporate persons, which is companies and limited liability partnerships. The DRT was intended to be the adjudicating authority for individuals and sole proprietorship concerns. However, the code for that, like the framework for that, for individual insolvency has not yet been notified. So DRTs are effectively not functioning under the code as of right now. So for currently, we have NCLT, NCLAT, and then the Supreme Court for any appeals from the orders of the NCLAT. Any references to adjudicating authority will mainly be to NCLT. So broadly, a few concepts under the IBC, I've reproduced them on the slide along with their statutory definition. I'll quickly run through them. As I said, corporate person under the code is a company, an LLP, and it expressly excludes financial service providers. At the time when the IBC was enacted, the section 227 of the IBC had empowered the central government to, if at all they realized that there was a need to enact rules to provide a framework for insolvency of any category of financial service providers that they saw fit. I think this need was most recently felt in the case of Diwan House Housing Finance Limited. I believe everyone would have read about it in the newspapers, but basically Diwan Housing Finance Limited is the first instance of a financial service provider going under debt restructuring. The procedure differs from the IBC. I will not go into detail regarding the procedure now. I'll probably chip in when Sneha is covering the procedure for corporate persons later. It'll make more sense then. But broadly speaking, the regulatory body for financial service providers is not the IBBI. If a financial service provider were to be taken into insolvency, the regulator in charge would be the RBI, as notified by the government recently. A corporate debtor, as I mentioned earlier, will be the entity who owes a debt to any person and against whom any proceedings under the IBC will be initiated. I know that this is a very basic definition, but it becomes very relevant as to who is the person in the definition of a corporate debtor. As you can see here, the person includes only an individual, an HUF, a company, a trust, a partnership, LLP. But initially, when the BLRC made a recommendation as to who all should be covered on the IBC, they definitely intended sole proprietorship and partnerships to also be covered under the definition of persons. But like I mentioned, as of right now, no framework for individual insolvency has been enacted. So they were left out of the definition. There is a division of opinions amongst NCLT as to whether, though it's definitely certain that a corporate debtor cannot be a sole proprietorship or a partnership concern, there is a division of opinion on whether the creditor can be a sole proprietorship or a partnership, considering that they're not covered within the definition of person. And I think that will get settled once a comprehensive framework is enacted. But as of right now, most NCLTs have held that if you are an operational creditor or a financial creditor, which is unlikely, and you are a sole proprietorship concern, it makes more sense to file in the name of the proprietor, who is an individual and hence covered within the definition, instead of filing under the name of your sole proprietorship, which is not covered under the code right now. The next definition is a corporate applicant. Corporate applicant can be a corporate debtor, a member or partner of the corporate debtor, any individual who's in charge of the management of the corporate debtor, or a person who has control over the corporate debtor. These people are the people under Section 10 who can initiate voluntary CIRP against the corporate debtor. I think Sneha will go a little bit more into detail about that, but of the three types of insolvency resolution proceedings envisaged under the code, one is definitely where the corporate debtor itself submits itself to debt restructuring under the provisions of the code, and the definition of corporate applicant becomes relevant then, because only these individuals can initiate CIRP against a corporate debtor. The definition is not an inclusive one, so definitely you can't travel beyond it to include anybody else. But it's a fairly wide definition, so I don't envisage anybody beyond these people trying to initiate insolvency against a corporate debtor under Section 10. Since the IBC is a creditor-driven process, the definition of creditor becomes very relevant. Though the definition of creditor includes a financial, operational, secured, unsecured creditor, as well as a decree holder, the IBC mechanism can only, as of right now, be triggered by a financial creditor and an operational creditor, a financial creditor under Section 7 and operational creditor under Section 9. The other creditors are included in the definition for the purposes of the satisfaction of their claims once the CIRP begins. They don't have any powers to trigger the procedure as of right now. The other important definition from the point of view of operational debts is definitely claim. It's very important for your debt to fall within the definition of a claim for you to even initiate an action under Section 9 for triggering, as an operational creditor for triggering the CIRP. Claim is, as you can see, a right to payment, but the definition says that it's not necessary such right to payment has to be reduced to judgment or fixed or, I mean, at all. So this has been interpreted to mean that even contingent claims are covered under the IBC, which may not have accrued yet, but they will accrue. However, such claims are only relevant for the purposes, again, of your proof of claim once the moratorium has been initiated, and cannot be the basis for triggering the IBC because of the definition of default, which I will come to. The next definition is the definition of debt, which is the liability or obligation in respect of a claim. Since debt restructuring is the main purpose of IBC, the definition of debt read with claim becomes very important. A liability or obligation has to definitely be in respect of only the criteria referred to in a claim. Anything that falls beyond the definition of claim will not be covered under the IBC, which was the problem faced by home buyers, which we will get to in a bit. Lastly, there's definition of default. Non-payment of debt when whole or any part or installment of the amount of debt has become due and payable. So the part has become due and payable means that the debt has to be payable in the present moment. So while it may be a claim which is something that you can enforce under the IBC if the corporate debtor were to go into CIRP, however, you cannot trigger the CIRP for just any claim. It has to be a claim which has become due and payable, and then there is non-payment of it once it becomes due and payable, and only then can it constitute a default under the IBC. Since
Shilpa, hello.
Yeah.
Shilpa, will you just go back to the slide?
Yes.
Claim, definition of claim. Do you want to also mention the amendment which sort of substituted right to pay, repayment to right to payment? Because subsequently,
I was going to get to that when I mentioned the operational debt.
Sure.
But if you want to, we can deal with it.
Sure.
Right now.
Okay.
Because actually, I will get to that when we deal with operational debt, because the amendment mainly came about as a result of the definition of operational debt and was subsequently affected to all other
sections. Yeah, sure.
So the first creature in the IBC process who can trigger the CIRP is the financial creditor, who is any person to whom a financial debt is owed. Financial debt is a debt along with interest, if any, which is disbursed against the consideration for time value of money. The section, the definition also includes an illustrative list of transactions. I have not reproduced them here. We can quickly go to them once I'm done explaining the section, but the essential feature for any debt to fall within the contours of financial debt would be time value of money. This was interpreted by the NCLT and NCLAT first in the decision of Nikhil Mehta and Sons, HUF and others versus AMR Infrastructure Limited. This decision is also relevant because it was a home buyer who had triggered the mechanism, and the entity did subsequently go into CIRP as a result of this petition. However, the petition was admitted not because it was a home buyer's debt, but because of the particular contours of the transaction, which is where time value of money comes in. the NCLT define time value of money to mean compensation, or basically the price that you pay for the amount of time that the debt remains due. An example of this would be when interest is payable. The longer it takes for your debt to be repaid, the more interest you earn on it. So it's definitely a debt which is disbursed against the time value of money. However, it's also been interpreted to mean to include any kind of a debt which has the commercial effect of a borrowing. So interest in that sense is not needed for there to be time value of money. Any amount that you lend which has the commercial effect of a borrowing would also fall within the contours of a financial debt. I'll just quickly refer to the decision in Pushpa Shah to explain how this was interpreted. So Pushpa Shah basically involved a letter of undertaking which gave a put option. If a put option is basically an option to buy the shares at a later date. So it gave a put option to the shareholders of LaFin, which was the corporate debtor here. It gave a put option to IL&FS to subscribe to the shares of LaFin, which was the corporate debtor there. What transpired was that when this put option was availed by LaFin after a period of 3 years, it was not honored by LaFin, and what LaFin did by its letter is also it denied its obligation to buy such shares. So as a result of which it became a debt which was due and payable, and the directors, the management of IL&FS filed a winding up petition under the Companies Act, which was later on converted to an IBC petition under Section 7 once the code was enacted. Basically, the contention of LaFin was that the letter which gave a put option was just a letter of comfort. There was no disbursement against consideration for time value of money. So because of that, it didn't fall within the definition of a financial debt, and hence it couldn't possibly trigger the mechanism under the code. In this, the NCLT stated that a financial debt can be of two types. Number one is when there is a time value of money, but the second is when any amount is raised under any transaction having commercial effect of a borrowing. So it's not necessary that every time the disbursement is necessarily against consideration for time value of money. If it is any disbursement which has the commercial effect of a borrowing, that is enough for the debt to fall within the contours of financial debt and be sufficient to trigger the mechanism under IBC. So in this case, then the put option holders were held to be financial creditors and were allowed to subsequently trigger the mechanism under Section 7. However, subsequently, this judgment has been set aside by the Supreme Court on grounds of limitation. So the merits still remain good. However, the decision no longer stands. The second would be the recent decision of the Supreme Court in Anuj Jain versus Axis Bank. The decision covers a lot of points, but one which was very interesting is whether a mortgage by a corporate debtor to secure the debts of a third party would fall within the definition of a financial debt. Mortgage being a financial debt instrument, one would consider that it would fall within the illustrative list, which is reproduced in the definition. I'll just quickly show the list so that everybody gets an idea. So financial debt is defined as a debt along with interest, which is disbursed against the consideration for time value of money. And it includes the following transaction. As you can see, it includes money borrowed against the payment of interest, includes any amount raised by acceptance under any acceptance credit facility. So what the NCLT held in this case is, though mortgages are debt instruments usually used, I mean, in financial transactions, when a financial creditor is basically intended to be a person who has a direct engagement in the functioning of the corporate debtor, usually financial debts involve an analysis of the viability of a business in the first place. So a financial creditor is inherently interested in the viability of a corporate debtor. However, when there is a mortgage by any party just to secure the debts of a third party, to that extent, they are only interested in the security interest created and the value of that security interest, and not the viability of a business as a whole. So resultantly, they wouldn't qualify to be a financial creditor, considering that they are not interested in the security, in the viability of the business as a whole, and are only limited to the security interest. So ultimately what the NCLT held is that though a mortgage debt may fall within the definition of debt, it does not qualify to be a financial debt for these reasons. There was also an amendment to the definition of financial debt, but I'll get to that in a bit because that relates to home buyers. The other entity who can trigger the mechanism under the IBC is an operational creditor. An operational creditor, like it says on the slide, is a person to whom an operational debt is owed. An operational debt has been defined as a claim in respect of the provision of goods or services. So earlier this section read to mean claim in respect of the provision of goods or services, including employment, or a debt in respect of the repayment of dues arising under any law for the time being in force. This was amended by the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Second Amendment Act of 2018. The purpose behind the amendment was to widen the scope of the definition of operational debt. There were concerns raised by regulators regarding the dues owed to them and what would be the definition within which their claim would lie if CIRP were to be initiated. Since repayment involved an obligation to pay only once you have received either a good or service, which was definitely not the intent of the code. It was amended from repayment to mean payment, which has a much broader connotation and ideally intended to deal with the concerns of regulators regarding the dues that would be due to them. The reason that a dues of a regulator will definitely fall within an operational debt is that an operational debt is basically a debt which is incurred during the course of operations of a corporate debtor. So your regulatory dues definitely relate to your operations and do not have the commercial effect of a borrowing, or are not borrowings disbursed against a time value of money. So they will definitely fall within operational debt, and the definition has been suitably amended to deal with those concerns. Accordingly, the definition, term repayment in every single place in the code, including the definition of claim, was changed to payment to ensure that the code as a whole deals with the concerns of every debtor who has a claim, as opposed to just someone who has incurred a default. The definition of operational debt, as in general, is quite a wide definition. So instead of covering what falls within the definition of operational debt, I thought maybe it'll be a little bit more illustrative to cover what is not falling within the definition of operational debt. There are quite a few decisions on this, but mainly the categories which have been conclusively held to not fall within the contours of operational debt are security, deposit or an advance, and damages and outstanding rent. Security, deposit or an advance was first dealt with in Jindal Steel and Power Limit. Actually, it was first dealt in overseas infrastructure, where the NCLT held security deposit or advance to be an operational debt and trigger the IBC mechanism under it. However, this was later overturned and explained in the reason for this was explained in Jindal Steel and Power Limited. Sorry, am I audible?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah.
Yes, Shilpa.
The reason that a security deposit on an advance has been held to not be an operational debt is, if you look at the definition of operational debt closely, it is a claim in respect of the provision of goods or services. This necessarily indicates that the provision of goods or services should be by the corporate debtor to the operational creditor. In the case of Jindal Steel, the facts were such that the corporate debtor was actually the one who was supposed to receive the services. And
You've trailed off, Shilpa.
I'm so sorry. Just a second. My laptop is hanging. Just a moment.
think both Shilpa and Sneha seem to have logged off. Shilpa should be back any moment now.
Hello.
Yeah, Shilpa, we lost you for a bit.
Yes, I'm sorry, but I dropped out of the call. I'll just share my screen again.
Is Sneha is also not on the call, right?
I think she is. I'm not sure.
Never mind, you continue. I'll just try and get in touch with her separately.
So, like I was saying, operational debt is a claim in respect of provision of goods or services. So, what it presupposes is either a seller-buyer relationship between the operational creditor and the corporate debtor, or a service provider service recipient relationship, where the operational creditor is usually the seller or the service provider. In the case of a security deposit or an advance, usually the situation is reversed. The corporate debtor would ideally be the seller or the service provider. And since that does not fall within the definition of an operational debt, hence a security deposit or an advance has been held not to amount to an operational debt, and not such a person who is owed a security deposit or an advance is not an operational creditor. The other situation in which an operational debt will not, which will not amount to an operational debt, is any claim for losses or damages or interest. The reason is that such claims in essence will require adjudication. A claim for damages does not arise out of, is not something that is quantifiable or arises out of just general operations of a company. Even if there are liquidated damages, they involve adjudication and leading of evidence for proving such damages. So since NCLT is a body and the whole, which cannot go into evidence, and the whole procedure under the code is effectively summary proceedings, any question of adjudication and any cases where evidence may have to be led automatically fall out of the ambit of the IBC, and hence any claims for losses or interest or damages will not fall within the purview of operational debt. The last case which I will deal with is the case of outstanding rent. This was dealt with by the NCLT in the case of M. Ravindranath Reddy versus G. Kishan. So again, the reasoning of the NCLT hinged on the fact that outstanding rent arises from a transaction involving an immovable property. The NCLT and later on the NCLAT were of the view that any dues arising out of transactions related to immovable properties necessarily involve leading of evidence. For instance, in this case, there was a question of enhanced rent and whether that was payable or was not payable. And the NCLAT was the view that this will necessarily require leading of evidence as to the intent of the parties to have such an amount to be due and payable. So considering again that summary proceedings are the IBC envisages only summary proceedings, this was left out of the purview of operational debt. There has not been a case where it has been that a simpliciter outstanding rent has been claimed as outstanding and due and payable. So I'm not certain what the view taken by the NCLT will be if it is an amount which is crystallized in the agreement and there is no evidence that needs to be led to prove that. However, the basis of the decision is also that any amounts arising or owed relating to immovable properties will necessarily require evidence. So chances are that, again, amounts like outstanding rent will not amount to operational debts and will not be due and payable under the IBC. I just briefly outline the differences between an operational debt and a financial debt under the IBC. Considering that these are the two major kinds of debt which are lead to triggering the mechanism under the code, it's very important to know whether your debt falls within financial debt or an operational debt. It's not as clear as the definition make it out to be. There is definitely an overlap which was seen in the case of home buyers, and which is why it's very necessary to know the differences between them. The first difference obviously is the very nature of the debt, because a financial debt is a pure financial contract, but an operational debt arises out of transactions on operations. So any borrowing effectively would be a financial debt, but an operational debt arises out of your daily interactions with your suppliers and your employees, etc. The other difference, as I already said, is that financial debt at the outset involves an analysis of the viability of the corporate debtor, because of that they have been held to be eligible for engaging in the restructuring of the loan in a much more direct and tangible way, considering that they understand the corporate debtor's business and the viability of it, and probably will be more well suited to engage in maximization of the value of the assets of such a corporate debtor. Whereas an operational debt, considering that it's something that's accrued during operations, operational debtors are not very concerned with the viability of a corporate debtor's business. So that is one major difference between a financial debtor and an operational debtor. Sorry, financial creditor and operational creditor. The other difference is the nature of the contract between these two entities. Usually, the very contract will differ. Financial contracts usually are for much larger sums of money. Operational debts will be for a smaller amount. They can accumulate over a period of time, but it's unlikely that the amount of financial debt, operational debt beats the amount of financial debt of a corporate debtor. Again, home buyers are our one exception to all of these, which I will get to in a while. The other consideration while drafting the code was that financial debtors are likely to be fewer in number, considering that these contracts involve a lot of documentation and usually securities and assessing the viability of the business. So it's likely to be that your financial creditors are just a couple of big lenders, whereas your operational creditors will be a lot more, considering that it's accrued in everyday business. Lastly, one chief difference would be that usually operational debts, considering that they are incurred much more frequently and are incurred as a in course of operation, will likely to have more dispute, more possibility of dispute, as opposed to financial debts, which are usually very well documented and basically involve a sum that is lent, which has to be returned in a certain amount of time. So since the possibility of a dispute on a financial debt is that much lower, a financial creditor is considered to be much more suited to be involved in the directly involved in the decision making of the debt restructuring that happens under the IBC. Sorry, there's one more difference in the nature of contract, which would be that there are well-placed protective measures within financial contracts, which is not usually the case with operational debts. Financial contracts usually give a financial creditor the right to recall a loan in the event it is not one or two installments are not paid. There are, in fact, a lot of regulatory bodies which also assist financial creditors in enforcing their security interest, which is not the case with operational debtors. Usually, cases of default and operational debt would ideally go to forums of dispute, such as arbitration or courts. So, financial debt, in that sense, is also a much more definitive way of looking at a default and triggering debt resolution in that sense. The other point of difference between the two is the trigger mechanism under the code. A financial creditor can trigger the mechanism under the code on behalf of another financial creditor, which is not a liberty granted to operational creditors, while operational creditors can seek to trigger the mechanism under the code as a class, if they are workmen or trade unions for that matter. No operational creditor can sue on behalf of the debt or default of another's debt. So in that sense, the trigger mechanism for a financial creditor is different. The other difference would be the basic requirements for filing, which Sneha will go into in a little more detail, but there is no requirement for a notice or any kind of pre-information statutorily to the corporate debtor in case of a financial creditor petition, but an operational creditor has to necessarily send a notice under Section 8 of the code and give the corporate debtor a chance to raise a dispute. Courts have interpreted a natural justice requirement to send a notice even in the cases of a financial debt, but there is no statutory recognition of such decisions. And as of right now, there is no statutory obligation on a financial creditor to send a notice before triggering the mechanism under the code. The idea behind, again, the different trigger mechanism is the involvement of a financial debtor in general in assessing the viability of a business and the quantum of a financial debt as opposed to an operational debtor whose debts are usually smaller and more easily dealt with in that sense. Lastly, there is a difference in the priority in payment envisaged under the code between a financial debtor and an operational debtor. There has been a recent amendment placing an operational creditor's debt higher above in the list of priorities, even above a financial creditor. But this is not what was envisaged when the code was enacted. The BLRC specifically envisaged financial creditors, and more particularly unsecured financial creditors, deriving the maximum benefit out of the IBC and their debts being repaid first. So the change that has come about recently is definitely was very very contentious. It's been dealt with by the Supreme Court also and held to be constitutional, but I'll come to what was the basis of the decision once Sneha has already explained the procedure. I think it will make more sense then. One of the biggest issues that has plagued the IBC ever since its enactment was the issue of the home buyers and their placement in this framework. The problem with home buyers was that there were NCLT decisions such as Colonel Vinod Awasthi and Nikhil Mehta, which held that a home buyer's debt was neither a financial debt nor an operational debt. So this led to a problem because they were left unprotected in the event a moratorium was declared. Not only were all the proceedings that had been initiated by them would stop, they would also not be able to avail any alternatives available to them. And as the case of JP Infratech revealed, the debts owed to these home buyers much exceeded the debts owed to any financial creditor. Thousands of crores were owed, and these people had already been waiting for possession of their properties for many, many years before any kind of a step was taken under IBC. The reason why they were held to be neither financial creditors nor operational creditors is because it was opined that clearly this debt was not a borrowing. It did not have a commercial effect of a borrowing, and it definitely was not a borrowing with against consideration for time value of money. So since it did not fall within any of those definitions, they were left out of the purview of the code. As a result of the lack of protection under the code, several petitions were filed in Supreme Court, including Chitra Sharma and Bikram Chatterjee, where the Supreme Court did give an interim stay and protected these home buyers. But meanwhile, what the IBBI did is that it stepped in and it created a third category of creditor for the purposes of proof of claim, which happens after a moratorium has been declared, and allowed these home buyers to file their claims before the IRP and for such claims to be considered in the ultimate debt resolution. This was definitely not enough because this still did not give home buyers the right to trigger the mechanism themselves. And there were a lot of drawbacks to this because a third class of creditors was never envisaged. It was only supposed to be the class of creditors which is defined in the code. And the question was whether the IBBI even has the power to step beyond the power given to it by the code, and was it excessive delegated legislation? Thankfully, the report of the Insolvency Law Committee, which came out in March of 2018, suggested that what they opined was that home buyers were always intended to be covered within the code, and that the definition of financial debt was broad enough to cover these home buyers. They basically opined that actually, I think I need to explain the case of Nikhil Mehta first for the decision of the report of the Insolvency Law Committee to make sense. So I'll just quickly revert to that. In Nikhil Mehta's case, there was an agreement for purchasing property in the project of AMR infrastructure. There was a plan offered to home buyers over there where they could choose a committed return plan and pay a major chunk of the amount for the property upfront, for which they will get assured returns every month in a certain percentage. So the AMR infrastructure continued to pay it for some time, and then they abruptly stopped paying the assured return, prompting the home buyers to take them to court. Subsequently, AMR infrastructures, prompting, they took them to court and they filed a Section 7 petition under the IBC, if I'm not wrong. What the court held over there is that the assured return clause under the agreement gave the amount owed to the home buyer the effect of a commercial borrowing, and considering that it was supposed to be paid on a monthly basis, it also was a disbursement against consideration for a time value of money. And hence, in this particular case, in the nature of the specific agreement, a home buyer's debt was considered to be a financial debt. So in light of this decision, the report of the Insolvency Law Committee considered that the home buyers were already effectively covered within the definition of financial debt as it existed, considering that usually the amount that is paid by home buyers is only meant to finance the project, to provide liquidity for the project so that it's not halted. And in that sense, it was a commercial borrowing and already covered in the under financial debt. But just to obviate any confusion, by the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Second Amendment Act, they inserted an explanation into the definition of financial debt, which I'll just put up on the screen just now. So this explanation was inserted as a result of the Second Amendment Act and as a result of the decisions in Chitra Sharma and Bikram Chatterjee.
Shilpa, we can't see the...
Just a moment, just give me a moment. Is it visible now?
Yes.
Has everyone read the explanation?
Yes.
Yeah.
So subsequently, obviously the Supreme Court passed its final decision in Chitra Sharma and Bikram Chatterjee and held that they retrospectively applied these amendments in those cases and recommenced the insolvency proceedings in JP's case, expressly directing that the home buyers be made a part of the committee of creditors. However, the validity of inclusion of home buyers as financial creditors was challenged in Supreme Court. Primarily, the grounds were that of debt owed by owed to a home buyer does not have any of the characteristics of a financial debt, and including home buyers as financial creditors defeats the objective for which IBC was enacted, which is that that there should be a time-bound procedure, considering that home buyers usually will be large in number and it takes a lot of time to assess the debt and default in such a case. It was argued that the inclusion of such home buyers as financial creditors, it was ultra vires the provisions of the Act as it was initially enacted. What the Supreme Court emphasized yet again, in deciding this case was that the amount that home buyers paid ultimately goes to finance the construction of such projects. They also analyzed the definitions and arrived at the conclusion that any sale agreement between a developer and a home buyer has the commercial effect of a borrowing. The idea is that I, as a home buyer, am giving you the price of that flat in advance so that you can finance your project and give possession to me that much quicker. In that sense, it amounted to a financial debt. And because I am paying money in advance in the interest of the entire project, that gives me a commercial interest in the project. And hence, I become a financial creditor to that extent as a home buyer. So this was one of the reasons for which Supreme Court upheld the validity of this section. What the other thing that was considered by the Supreme Court was the objective behind enactment of the IBC. Usually, what it said is that the reason real estate developers cannot be held to be operational debtors was operational creditors, is related to the very objective for which the code was enacted, because operational debts necessarily relate to a supply of good or services, which is not the case in for home buyers. They are neither supplying goods nor services. So classifying them as operational debtors, even by virtue of just expanding the definition of operational debtors, would defeat the objective of such a class of creditors being created. The second was the interest or stake that such an entity would have in the corporate debtor itself. Like I said, a financial debtor is usually involved in assessing the viability of a business even before they lend the money, which is something that a home buyer will also do. They will also assess the viability of the project. What are the chances that the builder will deliver in the amount of time that they have promised, and hence are more suited to be financial creditors as opposed to operational creditors. Lastly, what the Supreme Court also went into the time value of money, because they said that in real estate projects, money that is raised from the home buyers, the more in advance that you raise money, the more beneficial it is for the developer, and hence there's definitely a time value of money involved. And it makes more sense to classify a home buyer as a financial creditor, particularly in view of the fact that the documentary evidence that is usually present in financial debts is also present in the case of a home buyer by way of your seller agreements. So to that extent, the Supreme Court upheld the validity of inclusion of financial home buyers in the definition of financial creditors. Like I mentioned earlier, what the Supreme Court didn't answer and what is a major drawback is the abuse of the process of the IBC by including home buyers as financial creditors, primarily because of the volume of home buyers and resultant impact on time-bound proceedings. This was also felt by the legislature, which is why we recently had an amendment of the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code. This was earlier enacted as an ordinance, which has now been brought into force as an act in 2020. What the amendment proposes is the introduction of a minimum threshold. Now, as a home buyer, I simply cannot trigger the mechanism under the code purely for my own debt. I have to ensure that there are at least 100 allottees or at least 10% of the total allottees in a particular project before I trigger the mechanism under the code. This is envisaged to deal with the problems I've outlined earlier. However, the provision is challenged, and as of right now, there's a status quo order on this, so the validity of it remains pending.
Just to clarify, there's a partial stay on this. The stay is not on the Amendment Act, but only on the retrospective effect of this provision. So
Yes.
this amendment also suggests that any applications filed by these home buyers which are pending in NCLT and which are not yet admitted will have to go back and comply with this minimum threshold. However, the Supreme Court has sort of partially stayed this retrospective effect of this Amendment Act, but not the complete application.
Yes, thank you, Sneha, for clarifying. I'm going to move on to the definition of dispute now, which arguably was a subject of a lot of dispute earlier on when the code was initially enacted. As you can read, the definition of a dispute includes a suit or arbitration proceeding relating to the existence of the amount of debt, the quality of goods or service, or the breach of a representation of warranty. Earlier, this definition read as the existence of the amount of debt, the quality of goods or service, and the breach of a representation or warranty, and seemed to be an exhaustive definition as opposed to an inclusive one. Because of that, a lot of adjudicating authorities as well as NCLAT had differing views. NCLAT, in fact, had interpreted it to be an inclusive definition and had read and as or, but there was still a lot of debate because of the way that the definition was framed. This was conclusively decided by the Supreme Court in Moblox versus Carusa, which is the landmark judgment in with respect to the definition of dispute. What the Supreme Court held was that what has to be seen by an adjudicating authority when dealing with a dispute is that it's not just a patently feeble argument. This would mean that that it's not something that you come up with only once you receive the court. So receive the notice. It has to be something that existed between the parties, even though you may not have necessarily raised it as a dispute, but there have to have been emails suggesting what you are disputing now, and it definitely has to be there has to be some basis for alleging what you are alleging at the stage of disputing after receiving your Section 8 notice. It cannot be a spurious defense, which is mere bluster. It's basically what the Supreme Court opined is that there has to be a plausible contention. It does not matter whether it will succeed. It definitely needs to be something that looks to the adjudicating authority like it could have a fair chance at succeeding. So that's what the Supreme Court opined in this case. Interestingly, what the Supreme Court also went into is whether an allegation of dispute could be made by a financial, by a corporate debtor in the case of a financial creditor petition. As I said earlier, a natural justice requirement to send a notice had been read into the Section 7, the provisions of Section 7 by the Supreme Court in the decision of Innoventive. So going forward from that, what the Supreme Court held was that while a financial creditor does not have a statutory defense of raising a dispute, it could do so under the principles of natural justice. And the adjudicating authority would definitely have to look into such an allegation of dispute while deciding the petition. This decision was interestingly applied and furthered in the case of K. Kishan versus Vijay Nirman Company. The decision went on to hold that if there is a pending challenge to an arbitral award, that would definitely amount to a dispute. But interestingly, what the Supreme Court opined in that case was that any creditor, any operational creditor who is owed just a few lakhs cannot wind up an otherwise successful company, and that this is something that should ideally be kept in mind by the adjudicating authorities when dealing with operational creditor petitions. This has been interpreted subsequently by a lot of corporate debtors as the solvency defense, which finds its place in the UK Insolvency and Bankruptcy Act, but it is not codified and not present in our code. So what is the validity of such a defense, if at all? has clearly not come up yet, but it's definitely not a statutory defense available to a corporate debtor. The only basis for that is the judgment of the Supreme Court in K. Kishan versus Vijay Nirmal. Because of the judgment of the Supreme Court in Mobilox, the definition, as I said earlier, was amended to change and in the definition to or, and to make it a more inclusive definition as opposed to the exhaustive version earlier. Sneha, do you have anything to add?
No, go ahead, Shilpa.
Okay. One of the most important definitions, concepts under the IBC is the concept of a resolution plan, considering that the entire mechanism is triggered for the purposes of arriving at a resolution plan. A resolution plan is a plan that is proposed by a resolution applicant for the insolvency resolution of a corporate debtor as a going concern. The primary objective of the code is to arrive at debt resolution without approaching liquidation. So a properly structured resolution plan is essential for achieving the objectives envisaged in the code. So the definition of resolution plan or resolution applicant becomes very relevant for that. The resolution applicant is a person who individually or jointly with any other person submits a resolution plan. There are a lot of qualifications beyond this, which Sneha will be dealing with when it comes to resolution plan and resolution applicant. As of right now, what I will focus on is a resolution plan, which is effectively just simply the plan which deals with the debt resolution of the company. It envisages, it deals with all the debts of every single stakeholder involved in accordance with the provisions of the code. A resolution professional is simply an insolvency professional, as I had mentioned earlier. A resolution professional will step into the shoes of the erstwhile management once an application under the code is admitted, and will be involved in the day-to-day management of the corporate debtor till such time as the resolution plan is approved. Lastly, voting share, which is the share of voting rights of a single financial creditor. This becomes relevant when ultimately arriving at a resolution plan, because the voting share which is minimum threshold was amended recently. Again, Sneha will go more into detail regarding that. Last two definitions are the definition of insolvency commencement date. Considering that the procedure under the code is a very time-bound procedure, it's very important to know from when the clock starts ticking, which is your insolvency commencement date, which is the date of admission of an application for initiating corporate insolvency resolution process. This has been interpreted to exclude the amount of time it takes for the IRP to receive intimation of his appointment. Lastly, the definition of corporate guarantor, who's a person who is the surety in contract of guarantee to a corporate debtor. This was inserted by the Second Amendment Act of 2018 as a result of a lot of conflicts regarding what happens to a contract of guarantee when the moratorium is initiated. I think Sneha is dealing with that. Are you? Sneha? We'll deal with the
Yes.
All right. So Sneha, I think it's time for you to take over. I'm done with the concepts.
Sure. Does anybody have any questions regarding these concepts and terminologies? Am I audible?
Yeah, you are.
I don't see anyone having specific questions yet. Let's just proceed with the process, then we can
Sure.
deal with those.
Yeah. So as Shilpa has already clarified on who a financial creditor is. Basically, a financial creditor is somebody who disposes amounts in consideration of time value of money. So a financial creditor can make an application under section 7 for initiation of a corporate insolvency resolution process, which is CIRP. Uh, so basically, who can file an application as a financial creditor? One is obviously a financial creditor. Second is a financial creditor jointly with other financial creditor. And thirdly, and any other person on behalf of a financial creditor, for instance, an authorized representative of home buyers and allottees. Now, because the number of allottees in a real estate project, those home buyers is a huge number. So section 21(6)(a) authorizes a representative, mostly a resolution professional, who shall represent these home buyers in the CIRP process, and he can initiate he can basically file an application as a financial creditor under section 7. One second. Yeah. So as per the amendment which Shilpa has already dealt with, that there has to be a minimum threshold that a financial creditor that like an authorized representative of an allottee, which has to which an authorized representative has to comply with before making this application, which is 100 such creditors, or at least 10% of such class of creditors of the same class.
Hello, Sneha.
I think we've just lost her. I'm just trying to get her back in.
Okay.
She's just trying to join. She'll be with us in a minute. Just spoke with her.
Sneha's having some issues with her application. Meanwhile, till she joins, I'll just quickly attempt to cover the procedure for filing a application under Section 7. So as I had already covered, a financial creditor will be any person who lends money against consideration for time value of money, or whose debt has a commercial effect of a borrowing. Such a creditor can file an application under Section 7 of the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code. The Section 7 was recently amended to include a threshold limit for home buyers, wherein only not less than 100 home buyers or 10% of the creditors in a class could initiate a petition under Section 7. Otherwise, a financial creditor can file a Section 7 petition either alone or with other financial creditors, either in respect of its own debt, or in respect of the debt of another financial creditor. They can file a Section 7 petition in Form 1, which can be found in the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Application to Adjudicating Authority rules. Section 7 lays out certain certain documents that need to be filed by a financial creditor.
Yeah.
Okay, Sneha, you can take over. I'm sorry.
Sorry, where were you?
I've just begun the Form 1.
Application. Okay, so a financial creditor in his application, it should be in Form 1, which is specified in the application to adjudicating authority rules. Now, these are the three prerequisites which are mentioned in the section. One is the application. Second is the record of default with information utility or any other evidence of default. Now, as mentioned, because the information utilities are not functioning, and basically any other evidence of the default is accepted by the registry and considered by the tribunal. It could be anything, for example, like banker's books of evidence, which shows that no particular amount has been received from the corporate debtor for this particular debt. Or it could be any other information as may be specified by the board. Now, there are other essentials of an application which a financial creditor has to keep in mind while proving the application. One is that a financial creditor has to annex a copy of the agreement with the corporate debtor under which the debt has become due. It could be a loan agreement. So basically what the tribunal looks at is what was the arrangement between the financial creditor and the corporate debtor. Interest, if any, is payable. When was the default when did the debt become due? When was the default? And if the financial creditor has a claim against the corporate debtor. The second thing which are sort of essential in the application is the application should clearly mention the date of default, and the particulars of claim have to be in a tabular format, as in if the financial debt has been transacted in multiple tranches, all the tranches should specifically be mentioned in the tabular format, and each date of default of each particular tranche has to be clearly mentioned in the particulars of claim. Now, and thirdly, any other correspondence or document which sort of records that there is where a corporate debtor has sort of admitted his default or acknowledged his a default on that, sort of helps a financial creditor in proving his case. And fourthly, consent of the IRP is supposed to be annexed to the form application as well. Will you please move on to the next slide? Shilpa. Yeah. So basically, after the application has been completed, what the tribunal looks at is like after satisfying itself of the admission of debt, it passes an order of admission of the ad, admission of and initiation of the corporate insolvency resolution process. Similarly, in terms of Shilpa, go back to the operational creditor, please. Yeah. Similarly, in terms of operational creditor, even though the application procedure is quite similar, one prerequisite in this section 8 is issuance of demand notice by an operational creditor. One second. Now, while sending the demand notice, the operational creditor has to keep in mind that the demand notice must specify that the notice is under Section 8 of IBC, so that the corporate debtor is made aware of the repercussions of failure to respond to this notice. The demand notice can either be in Form 3 or Form 4. So now Form 3 is for a cases where there has been a written agreement between the operational creditor and the corporate debtor. And Form 4 is in the cases when there has been no particular written agreement, but there has been an exchange of invoices. So Form 4 sort of gives a tabular format in which you have to mention the invoices that were issued to the corporate debtor and a demand that has been made for repayment of that operational debt. So after the demand note, so one more, another essential while sending the demand notice is that the authorized representative must be specifically authorized to issue the demand notice under this particular section. Now, this was under as per the judgment in the matter of Macquarie versus Shilpi Cables, where the Supreme Court has made clear that only an authorized person, specifically authorized under this by a board resolution to initiate actions under IBC, is allowed to issue even the demand notice under Section 8. So we always advise our clients that even when you're issuing a demand notice, make sure that the person is authorized by a board resolution, a valid board resolution in that case. Yeah. So once a demand notice has been issued by an operational creditor to the corporate debtor, the corporate...
I'm so sorry, Sneha. Do you want to highlight the challenges regarding which were raised initially, whether a lawyer can be an authorized person?
Yeah, sure. So basically, in the judgment, what the court held is that the lawyer is authorized by a valid wakalatnama in terms in the history of legal system, and also that if a lawyer is authorized to sort of issue a demand notice, it only shows the seriousness of the operational creditor to make that demand of that operational debt. If you have anything further on that particular judgment, if you, Shilpa, you can please add to it. Shilpa?
No, I'm sorry. No, I don't. It's just that initially it was opined that since the code doesn't really define authorized person to include a lawyer,
Right.
lawyer would not fall within the definition which was clarified with Supreme Court and Macquarie.
Right.
That is all I wanted to add.
Yeah, so it would only show the seriousness of the operational creditor to authorize a lawyer to sort of issue a demand notice.
But I don't think that any express authority beyond
Wakalatnama, yeah.
yes, or even wakalatnama. Actually, I mean the judgment doesn't specify a wakalatnama. It just says that I mean the way usually lawyers receive mandates from their clients and
That's right.
to act on their behalf would be enough.
Sort of. Yeah. So once a demand notice has been issued to an operational creditor, the operational creditor has 10 days to either respond to the demand notice to notify that there has already been an existence of dispute, or there has been any pending suit or a proceeding or an arbitration dispute between the operational creditor and the corporate debtor in terms of this particular operational debt. Or the other defense that's available with the operational creditor is to make the payment of the amount in default. Now, these are the only two defenses available with an operational creditor after of which the operational creditor can directly go and file an application initiating the CIRP. Now, in the application for initiating a CIRP against by an operational creditor, there has to be the operational creditor has to attach a copy of the demand notice along with the proof of delivery to show that a valid demand notice was issued, which was delivered to the operational creditor, and also has to give an affidavit stating that no notice of existence of dispute has been given by the corporate debtor to the operational creditor, or there is no existence of any such dispute pertaining to that operational debt. Now, and the third requisite was that a bank certificate or any bank certificate was required from a particular bank which sort of had, which would operate the account of the operational creditor, to say that no amounts for that operational debt has been received in the account of the operational creditor. Now, as we all know, if that this particular requirement was a task, because not all banks were willing to give these certificates, and also that this doesn't because IBC doesn't really apply in foreign jurisdictions. So what happened is, in cases of foreign banks, this certificate was not available. Now, again, in the McQuarrie judgment, the Supreme Court has held that this is just an operational required, and subsequently an amendment has been made to include that any other evidence which proves that no amount has been received by the corporate debtor should be accepted by the registry. Shilpa, do you have anything to add on this, on the bank certificate?
Just that I think additionally the Supreme Court said that in the event that you are not producing, though the requirement is just directory and not mandatory, a corporate debtor should explain the reason for not.
Yeah, so in the event that a bank is not willing to give that certificate, and the operational creditor has to mandatorily file an application with the registry stating that this is the correspondence that was issued to bank requesting for such a certificate. The bank has responded or not responded or has denied or refused to give this certificate on these grounds. So this affidavit is sort of mandatory under the application, which has to be annexed to the application. We have a query which says that is there a maximum time limit for filing an application for initiation of a CRP from the date of demand notice? No, there is no such maximum time limit for filing an application. It's just that after the 10-day period, after the delivery of the demand notice on the corporate debtor has sort of is over, a corporate debtor can file, an operational creditor can file an application anytime after that. There's no sort of like an upper limit for filing the application.
However, just to be safe, considering that the whole purpose of sending the demand notice was to put the corporate debtor at notice of such an action being taken against him, if you wait for like a period of 6 months to file a Section 9 application after sending such a notice, that 6 months should ideally be explained very well, just because that amount of gap in time could lead the corporate debtor to believe that the dispute that they've raised or that such an action is not going to be taken anymore, and would then be counterproductive to the requirement of actually sending such a notice.
Yeah, that would weaken the creditor's case. Yeah. So here, in the event of an application made by an operational creditor, it sort of gives an option to the operational creditor to not propose the name of an IRP, but an operational creditor can always request a tribunal to propose or appoint an IRP. In this case, can we go to the slide, Shilpa? I can't see the slide. No, the previous slide. Can't see it.
Which slide do you want me to turn to, Sneha? Sneha? I think Sneha has dropped out again.
Yeah, I think we've lost her again.
I'll just take over.
Yeah.
As I had mentioned earlier, there are three ways to trigger the process under the under IBC. Either a financial creditor can trigger the process, a operational creditor can trigger the process. There is a third situation envisaged wherein a corporate debtor itself triggers a debt debt restructuring process against itself. That is under section 10 of the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code. What the corporate debtor needs to show the adjudicating authority in this instance is that it has defaulted in its payment obligation and is unable to meet such obligations, and that its shareholders have all agreed in majority for it to proceed to file an application under section 10 of the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code. As with other applications, there are certain prerequisites which are built in within the section itself. Section 10 describes that a corporate debtor should provide information relating to its book of accounts so that the NCLT can basically ascertain the financial position of the corporate debtor to ensure that it's actually unable to pay its debts and that it's not just escaping its obligations to its respective creditors. The NCLT will also look into the IRP who has been proposed by this corporate debtor to again ensure that the IRP is qualified and has all the essentials to manage the affairs of the corporate debtor. The third very, very important aspect in a corporate debtor petition is, like I mentioned, shareholder resolution. A special resolution has to be passed by the shareholders of a corporate debtor with at least 3/4 majority approving the filing of such an application in order to entitle the corporate debtor to file a Section 10 petition. This is a prerequisite, and any application will not even be considered without such a shareholder resolution being placed on record. Once these prerequisites are satisfied and the NCLT is certain that the corporate debtor is not trying to escape its debts and that its financial position is truly such that it is unable to meet its debts, it will proceed to admit the application. There are two immediate impacts of admission of any application, whether it be a financial creditor petition or an operational creditor petition or a corporate debtor application, as the case may be. The NCLT will immediately declare a moratorium under section 13 of the code. This moratorium effectively operates to stop the initiation of proceedings either by the corporate debtor or against the corporate debtor from the moment an application is admitted by the NCLT. Any pending litigations or actions against or by the corporate debtor also immediately stand stayed from the date that the moratorium is announced. Along with the announcement, declaration of the moratorium, there is also a obligation on the IRP who is appointed to declare, to make a public announcement within 3 days of the date of him receiving the order from the NCLT. Usually, the IRP is appointed immediately from in the same order, which is the order of admission. However, if the corporate debtor did not suggest the name of any IRP while they file the application, this will delay the process a little bit, because the NCLT will then have to go back to IBBI for the pool of insolvency professionals maintained by them, and the IBBI will then accordingly consider the application, go through the merits, go through the kind of business that is run by the corporate debtor, and accordingly suggest a couple of names to the adjudicating authority, and the adjudicating authority will then determine who should be the IRP in this case, which can take up to 14 days, considering that as a creditor, you want these to be time-bound proceedings. It is advisable that you suggest your IRP at the stage of application itself. The IRP who is then appointed has to make a public announcement. The format of the public announcement is provided in the regulations itself. Ideally, the public announcement should inform all the creditors of the corporate debtor that CIRP has been initiated against this corporate debtor, that the corporate debtor is the date of the initiation of the insolvency commencement date, as I had earlier mentioned, has to be informed in the public announcement. The last date when the applications can be received, which according to section I'm sorry, I think it's section 16 if I'm sorry. So the applications that can be received can be received up to 14 days from the date of appointment of the IRP. So he has to specify that in the public announcement, that what is the last date when he will receive applications for proof of claims by the creditors of the corporate debtor. The public announcement also has to specify the email address as well as the correspondence address of the IRP. Lastly, this public announcement has to be uploaded on the website of the corporate debtor and published in newspapers, one English language newspaper and one regional newspaper, to ensure that all the creditors of a corporate debtor are aware of initiation of CIRP against this corporate debtor. The effect of the declaration of the public announcement and the declaration of moratorium against a corporate debtor is that immediately upon declaration of the moratorium, all non-essential activities will be stayed for the duration, that's 180 days plus 90 days. For a period of 270 days, all non-essential activities of the corporate debtor will cease. No suits can be instituted and no continuing suits will be allowed to continue for 270-day period. The corporate debtor also, by virtue of the moratorium, is stopped from either transferring any of its assets or mortgaging them, or in any other manner attempting to alienate them. The idea again is that in debt restructuring, each and every asset of the corporate debtor will be considered for maximum value, and by alienating, they don't want for the corporate debtor to escape the process. So there is an immediate moratorium to that extent. There is, however, an exception created for essential goods and services. The provision of essential goods and services will not be impacted by virtue of this moratorium. Essential goods and services are basically goods and services which have been interpreted to mean goods and services which are necessary for the survival of the business as a growing concern. Recently, an amendment actually clarified that any regulatory dues would fall within the ambit of essential goods and services and would have to be have to be met even during the CIRP, even during the moratorium period, because let's say for a broadcasting entity or an entity which requires any kind of a regulatory license, the payment of a license fee is very essential for the viability of the business, because that is the main business that they run. So payment of license fee would have to ideally be complied with even during the moratorium period.
I think I'd like you to pause here. One is that I'd like that if there are any questions, let's take them. And when we begin tomorrow, then because you were dealing with what are the types of proceedings, if I may call those, that could continue, or liabilities that could continue during the time that the moratorium subsists. You identified one of those being regulatory oriented payments and statutory dues, if any. Tomorrow when we begin, we can also discuss the interplay between proceedings that are ongoing, perhaps before the Prevention of Money Laundering Act Tribunal and the IBC, the NCLT, NCLAT, because there is an interesting matter that goes into the interplay of those two legislations as well.
Yeah,
so we'll start off with that tomorrow and then continue further. And also I think Sneha is having problems with joining in time and again on account of connectivity issues. So then we can carry on tomorrow. Any questions that anyone has?
I think there is a question regarding whether there's any case where the maximum time limit has been dealt with. I will get back with respect to that in tomorrow's session.
And in any case, I think this questions come from Hiral. Of course, one only has to be careful about limitation in terms of the fact that it applies there. Other than that, we haven't come across any specific, I think I haven't come across any specific instance which says that if a time limit is prescribed of 10 days, then that's typically the minimum time that you must wait before you move. But thereafter, till such time that the limitation expires, I don't see any stipulation that it must be done in a certain period of time. But Shilpa will get back tomorrow with whether there is anything specific in this regard.
As per my knowledge, there has been no judgment as yet opining on this, but I'll just confirm and get back to you tomorrow.
Noted. Thank you.
Also, just look up that the limitation or a matter. Maybe it says something there. Good. If there are no further questions, then we'll log out for the day and continue with the session tomorrow. Thank you so much for joining, and thanks Shilpa and Sneha.
Thank you. Thanks, Shilpa, Sneha. Bye.